This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're talking some more about Lost Caverns of Ixalan this week. Last week, I took a look at some 17 lands data and discussed 10 cards that are being taken, far too early, given how they're actually performing in the format. This week, we're doing the opposite. I'm going to be taking a look at 10 cards that aren't being taken early enough, given how good they are. So these are sort of the underrated cards. Last week was sort of the overrated cards. As always, a reminder, you can check out 17lands.com. They track Magic Arena data, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to learn from it. As always, data is not the end-all, be-all about, Magic, but it is incredibly useful. So, as usual, I like to start these videos with sort of a baseline card, a card where there's, a consensus in the format about how good or bad a card is, and then use that card to compare, all the other cards I'm going to talk about to it. And the baseline card this time is Dead Weight. It's got an average pick of 5.6, and it's got a win rate of 55.5%. Every single card in this video is taken later than Dead Weight, and it's also got a higher win rate. Now, Dead Weight, I think, is an example of a card where the data doesn't tell us everything. Its 55.5% win rate would just mean it's like an average card, because that's the average win rate of 17 lands users. But the reason for that is that black collectively is the worst color in the format, and that can pull down the win rate of a card like this. In reality, the fact that it has a win rate of 55.5% is actually pretty good, within black, because it's better than most black cards are. So suffice it to say, this card does have a win rate that kind of indicates that it's worse than it actually is. But even with that in mind, the cards on this list are pretty much all cards that you would take at least the first copy of over Dead Weight, and you will see from the data that they're performing better. Some of them are even black, at least one is. So, it doesn't have the same excuse for its win rate, or it does have the same excuse for its win rate, but it doesn't really matter. All right. So let's dive into the list, and we're going to start with Goblin Tomb Raider. This one's interesting to me because this card has, if you've played this format, aggressive red artifact decks are a thing. Especially blue-red can be really successful, but black-red too. And the Tomb Raider is just a beating in that deck. I mean, you play it on turn 1 as a 1-2, and then on the next turn it's usually attacking as a 2-2. And curving out in this format can really win games quickly. That said, it also has decent late game upside. I mean, a random 1-mana 2-2 haste can often really change combat math, and that's part of what keeps its win rate relatively high at 57.2%, and its average pick is 7.3. So taken significantly later than Dead Weight, but it is doing a much better job. And I would first pick, the Tomb Raider, the way the format has shook out, ahead of Dead Weight. Even though, I think Dead Weight is the better card, but when they're kind of comparable cards, with the Tomb Raider, we're talking about a card that's like in a color that is better than black, and that does matter when you're trying to decide what you're going to pick. Obviously, if black ends up being open, you should be in black, but when you're talking about your first pick, taking a card that is in a better color is a pretty good tiebreaker to figure out what it is that you want to do. Next, let's look at a fellow black card that has a higher win rate, but is being taken later than Dead Weight, and that is Tithing Blade, which is picked around 6.6, and it has a 56.7% win rate. I like this card a ton. I like most of the craft cards. I think they're all designed in a really interesting and usually flavorful way. This one, an Edict effect really isn't very good usually in Limited. I mean, it's pretty good on turn 2 when you kill their 2-drop or whatever, but the later the game goes, the worse an Edict effect gets. Well, the great thing is that, you can use this in the later game to turn it into a very real card, one that really alters a race significantly. If you've played this format a bunch, and maybe even if you haven't, you've won games thanks to Tithing Blade transforming, and you've lost games to it too. And the times where you can play this early and, trade for a full card instead of a token or something, and then in the later game you can transform this, it feels really absurd when you can do that. I mean, if we could see what the win rate on the card was when it did that, I imagine it's like, 60-something, because we're talking about just so much value out of a single card. It doesn't always line up that way, of course, but overall, this card, it's performing better than Dead Weight. The fact that it's an artifact has some bearing on that too, because obviously artifacts matter in the format. But the fact that it's removal that turns into a really problematic card late is what really makes it perform so much better than Deadweight does. All right, let's take a look now at Jade Seed Stones. So this is another one of these craft cards, which, you know, as I've said in past videos, collectively, if you were just going to assume every craft card is playable, and at least playable, and often better than that, you'd be right way more often than you aren't. And Jade Seed Stones is another example of that. It's picked around the 8th pick, but it has a 55.9% win rate. Again, you know, you get a card up front that isn't always that good. You know, putting counters on stuff isn't always meaningful enough to really be worth it. But it does add to the board. It makes a difference in most board states, even if it's not a huge one. And then in the later game, you know, this can transform into a very real creature that gains you life. It's a nice card against more aggressive decks in the format because the front side can help grow your creatures enough to survive, you know, to be more capable blockers to, you know, slow the game down on the ground. And then in the later game, it gives you a big creature that gains you life, which is always, you know, sort of an aggro deck's worst nightmare. And this is a card that does it. You know, it becomes very real creature late, has sort of a meager effect up front, but you end up getting pretty close to 2 cards worth of value out of it if you can make the game go long enough. And it's one of the better ways to stabilize in this format. Let's look at another green card now, Pathfinding Axe Jaw. I mean, just sort of like, you know, I was saying about craft, most of the cards with Explorer just pretty good too. Pathfinding Axe Jaw, certainly one of those. It has a win rate of 57.7%, so, you know, 2.2% higher than Deadweight, and it's taken just slightly later at 5.7. You know, not that much to say here. I mean, the Dino deck is one of the better decks in the format. You know, the tiers are sort of like, I think the tier one is pretty much the more aggressive decks that are, you know, like red, white, blue, red, that kind of thing. The second tier is the Dino deck, really, which is more of a mid-range deck. It can be really aggressive too, but it's definitely more capable of, you know, winning the game in the mid game. And then tier 3 is the Descend decks. You know, those decks can be good, but they are at, you know, something of a disadvantage. But it is nice that those Descend decks are good because it does mean slower decks in the format can do something. It's just that, you know, the other decks are overall better. You know, there's a tier 4 too that's filled with several decks, unfortunately. So it's not that bad. It is one of the competitive decks in the format, Descend. But the point here with our Pathfinding Axe Jaw is that you know, it's a Dino for the green-red Dino deck, and that's a big part of, you know, just what makes it a pretty nice card. But it's also just a good rate. I mean, you know, it wasn't that hard to tell in the set review that a card that's either a 4-mana 4/3 that draws you a card or a 5-mana 5/4 with Surveil 1 was just going to be a nice rate, and that is absolutely how it has panned out. You know, Explore is just a really nice mechanic, and the Axe Jaw is one of the best green commons, and, you know, it's probably not quite being taken as one. It should probably be getting taken a little bit higher than it is. But it is being taken pretty highly for a common, but I think it's even better than where it's currently being taken. Let's take a look now at Cog Wrestler. This is another one that's interesting to me, like Goblin Tomb Raider is, because from like day one, it was pretty clear this card was good. You know, it's another 1-drop, which is just an important thing to have, and it's an artifact. Both of those are great. But it's being taken as late, around the 8th pick, 7.76, and it's got a 58.1% win rate, which is higher than the win rate of every other card I'm talking about in this video. So that's really high, you know, for a 1-mana common. And we've seen this a lot with this type of effect recently. It's almost always ended up playing out reasonably well, where you can add a body to the board and lower the power of something. You know, you can, if your opponent attacks you with like any X1, the Cog Wrestler can flash it and kill it and keep itself alive. But then there are situations, you know, that's like the ideal situation, right? Because you're probably getting a 2-for-1. But you can also just set things up where you flash in the Wrestler and like triple block something and they can only kill your Wrestler, stuff like that. And it just really alters combat when you cast it. On top of that, it is very important that it's a cheap artifact. You know, it ends up comboing really well with the blue-red Signpost uncommon because it becomes even more of like a combat trick effect because you get a +1/+1 counter and the -2. And that's a line of play that happens like all the time in this format. And there are other cards that check for artifacts entering that make it kind of an interesting card too because of flash. So overall, the Wrestler has just been, you know, a great common and certainly should be taken higher. I mean, it does have the problem of, you know, it's not amazing in multiples because the effect is situational enough, But it's really not bad either, because it just has a very useful card type. So I am surprised it's being taken as late as it is, especially when you really look at this win rate. Let's look now at Volatile Wander Glyph. So this is being taken around pick 6.68. It's got a win rate of 56.7%. So it's being taken like, you know, if we were just talking about Cog Wrestler, it's being taken ahead of that, despite the fact that it has a significantly lower win rate. But it is on this list because it should be getting taken even higher than it is. You know, it is a you know, pretty big overperformer in the format. 2-mana 2/2 artifact creature would probably just make the cut anyway in this artifact-centric format. But then it has this pretty useful ability of rummaging. This can set up your cards with Descend. It can set up your effects that have your craft effects and stuff like that. And probably better than any of that synergy is really just that it lets you dig deeper into your deck while getting rid of a card you don't really need, or that you can potentially get value out of your graveyard with. And again, you know, any artifact creature that is cheap and reasonably efficient is pretty darn good in this format, because those artifact aggro decks are legit. You know, they're a real problem. When they get their best draw, they're going to beat anybody, basically. And the more good 1 and 2 and 3 drop artifact creatures you have, the better you're going to have a chance of those sorts of draws. And then the Wander Glyph even helps improve your draw and how it's going to go in a particular game. Let's look now at Waylaying Pirates, which is being taken around pick 8.4, and it has a 56.2% win rate. This card can be an absolute beating. Like, if you're playing the blue-red artifact aggro deck, this card is it's just a nightmare. Because, you know, you're like, okay, I finally played something that can block their really obnoxious, cheap artifact creatures, their Wander Glyphs and stuff. I'm in good shape here. And then they play this, they tap down your best blocker and attack you just like they did the turn before. and they added to the board. I mean, you know, that sequence is just a complete beating, and it's one that this common causes all the time. Like, if you really curve out with, and it's not that hard to do, you know, 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, Waylaying Pirates, game's usually over. And I think that's reflected by this card having a relatively high win rate. And I think you want one of these in like every blue artifact aggro deck you have, and, you know, even running a couple feels pretty good. So it should probably be getting taken ahead of pick 8.4, especially with the win rate we see that it's picking up. Let's look at Deconstruction Hammer now. So of all the cards we're looking at here, oh no, it has the second latest average pick of 9.3, which is not very high at all, right? And it has a 55.7% win rate, so a little bit higher than Deadweight. You know, white is one of the better colors, and this is sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's being pulled up by there being better white cards, you know, than Deadweight has. You know, Deadweight by its nature is going to be played with worse cards, right? So the win rate's going to be lower. And if we accounted for those things, I can almost guarantee you that Deconstruction Hammer has a lower win rate. But it should still be getting taken ahead of pick 9.3. So first of all, having ways to blow up artifacts and enchantments in your deck is just kind of a good idea. But, you know, the part of this card that has overperformed maybe is just the equipment part. There are a lot of decks that just want to play 1-drop flyer, especially in blue and white, you know, if you're in one of those colors. Play a 1-drop flyer and enhance that flyer, see if your opponent can kill it. and that is kind of what the game amounts to. And Deconstruction Hammer is a great way to do this. You know, maybe it's not quite as good as Exploring or the 2-mana 1/2 that puts a counter on your turn 1 flyer, but it does an okay impression of those cards. And then it has more late game upside than those cards do, because it can just come down and deal with a problem permanent. So it's not a card that's like terrible when you get it late. In fact, it can be really impactful late, and it's also really impactful early if you've got, you know, a few of those 1-drops. You know, it doesn't even have to be a flyer. I mean, slapping it on Goblin Tomb Raider, for example, is also a pretty great turn 2 after you played Tomb Raider on turn 1. So, yeah, I mean, this card has ended up being a nice little, you know, artifact hate piece that also is like a decent baseline equipment, and you want one in pretty much all your white decks. Let's look now at Unlucky Drop. So this is being taken the latest of all of these, and it has the second highest win rate of any card we're looking at too. And so average pick of 10 and a win rate of 57.5%. So part of the reason for this here is just the mana cost. You know, this format, you need to be doing fairly assertive things, even if you're not, even if you're a Descend deck that's going to make the game go long, even if you're a Dino deck that's sort of mid-rangier, you are generally going to need to be doing stuff early. And so you do and should put more of a priority on ways to interact that are cheaper or things that just add to the board. And that's part of the reason it's being taken as late as it is. Like, you don't want that many 4-mana removal spells in this format. But, I mean, the first copy, I think, is pretty great. The 57.5% win rate is a pretty serious card, a pretty serious removal spell. And people just tend to overrate this effect, like, every time we see it anyway. And it does depend on the format. Sometimes they're not great. Like, in the last format, there was one that wasn't good. In Lord of the Rings, there was one that was pretty good. And then there's this one, which I think is the best of the ones we've seen lately. These 4-mana, put a creature, and in this case, or an artifact, on top or bottom of your opponent's library, and that choice up to them. In this format, it ends up being pretty good for, like, a number of reasons. First, it's just like a reasonably efficient removal spell. That's the most obvious thing. But I think the thing that maybe is contributing the most to its... there's a couple things contributing to its higher win rate. One is people buff, like, one creature a lot in this format, like I was talking about earlier. And when you can remove those creatures, by bouncing them or time-ebbing them to the top of your opponent's library, you're really dealing with a lot more than just that one card. And second, it interacts pretty well with Discover. And, like, there are times, because you can cast Unlucky Drop in response to a Discover trigger and put, like, something on top of their library that you'd much rather they hit. That's not always incredible, of course, but it is an interaction that actually matters and comes up sometimes. But in general, this kind of card is just better removal than it looks like it is, because it does trade 1-for-1, even if your opponent has the option of getting the card back. But you can also bounce stuff with this where you're like, I really don't want this on the board, and I'm not really sure they want to draw it either. So, it isn't that rare for them to choose to put the card on the bottom. So this card is definitely overperforming. You'd think the fact that it's in blue and not a permanent would hurt its win rate some too, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. And the last card I want to talk about is Explorer's Cache, which has an average pick of 7.4 and a win rate of 55.8%. This card has been a big overperformer, I think. I didn't love it in the set review. These sorts of cards that just sort of give you a couple of counters, they don't usually feel that great. But for reasons I've already discussed here, enhancing, like, one evasive creature is a great strategy in this format in the early game, and this can get that going. And then, getting the counters back isn't that hard. You generally want to spread them out so that you can get the get counters back more frequently. But it ends up really seriously being able to just keep buffing your creatures that you play, like, all game long, because of how it interacts with other +1/+1 counters, and how it just interacts with itself. So it's ended up being a really real card, not like a card you look at and you're like, well, I don't know if it gives me a card worth of value. It tends to. It ends up feeling like an engine that gives you a +1/+1 counter every turn, like, half the time. And that's a card you'd always play for 2 mana. So it ends up really doing a seriously good job in a lot of the green decks in the format. There's lots of tramplers in the format, too, that the counters get better and better on. We not only have these cheap flyers, there's like a plethora of trample in this format, too, on the big dinos that are in green. So it ends up working out pretty well. So those are 10 cards in Lost Caverns of Ixalan that are better than you probably thought they were. We're getting close now to the next set, Karlov Manor. I might end up doing a video on the Cons limited format next week. I'm not sure I will, because the other video I did on it didn't do particularly well. Hopefully I'll at least get a draft up of that format tomorrow from when you'll be watching this. I wanted to try to do it this week, but things just came up. It's it's Hanukkah and stuff like that, so it just ended up not really working out because I was way too busy. So hopefully I get one up tomorrow. At least there'll be one draft of the format. But if I don't talk about Cons of Tarkir next week, it'll probably be a more general video about Limited, which is what I often do, sort of in between sets, which we don't have that much time in between them usually these days. But yeah, that's what we'll be doing next week. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.